Okay, good morning, everyone. As far as our last class was concerned, as I remember, we had discussed about acid rains, water pollution, noise pollution, and then we had also begun our discussion with soil pollution. So, in this class, we'll initially begin with the impacts of soil pollution, then we'll move on to radioactive pollution, and ultimately we shall move on to a new topic. Okay, so as far as the impacts of soil pollution is concerned, now as you already know that one of the primary impacts of soil pollution is that it definitely reduces the soil fertility and invariably the soil productivity. And why does soil pollution reduce soil fertility or soil productivity? Now the answer to this question lies in the fact that whenever we are applying unnecessary fertilizers and pesticides onto the soil, so that disturbs soil's biological diversity. Several useful flora and fauna, they are killed, and that impacts the, what you can say, fertility of the soil. So that is a very primary impact of soil pollution. Now one more impact which we can talk of is that if you remember that soil pollution is often caused due to dumping of wastes onto the soil. So these wastes, this garbage, urban refuse, industrial waste, agricultural refuse, etc. Now when water falls on them in the form of rain, uh, a part of that waste dissolves in rainwater and moves and percolates through the soil and ultimately reaches the groundwater. So you are polluting the soil, but a part of the pollutants dissolved in water moves down through the soil to reach the groundwater and thereby polluting the groundwater. So you begin with soil pollution, but you also end up resulting in pollution of the groundwater. So this is also another impact. The third impact which we can talk of is that uh, when we are applying a lot of fertilizers and pesticides onto our soils, now these soils, from these soils the plants take up these fertilizers and pesticides, and when we consume these plants, the fertilizers and pesticides from the plants come into the human body, and in the human body they cause a variety of physiological disorders. They may cause disorders of the kidney, disorders of the liver, disorders of the intestine, stomach, etc., etc. So these three are the three most prominent impacts of soil pollution. So that is reduction in soil fertility and productivity, pollution of groundwater through dumping of garbage on the soil, and then ultimately health impacts caused due to excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides. Now one more impact associated with soil pollution is that whatever agricultural fertilizers you are adding onto the soil in uncontrolled amounts, when these are washed down, they will be washed down onto a surrounding water body, and in that water body, that is a lentic system. Lentic system means we are talking of a stagnant water body. It invariably causes what you can say eutrophication of the water body, and that is a part of cultural eutrophication which we have talked of in water pollution, where excess of nutrients are added to the water body, leading to what we call as algal bloom. Okay, so these are just three or four of the impacts of soil pollution. Now after talking about soil pollution, we will move on to radioactive pollution. We shall move on to radioactive pollution. Now as far as radioactivity, you already know that those elements which are heavier than lead, they give out certain emissions from their nucleus, and such nuclear emissions are often termed as radioactivity or radioactive emissions, and they can be alpha particle emissions or beta particle emissions, or they may be gamma ray emissions, etc., etc. So these radioactive substances, they come in from a variety of sources, but you must remember that on our planet we are constantly exposed to some amount of radioactivity, that which is naturally present always. Say for example the solar radiation which we are getting from the sun, so that also contains some amount of radioactivity. If you think of the space, the cosmos, so from the space or the cosmos some radiations infiltrate our planet. Then there are certain geological structures inside our planet, for example certain rocks, certain kinds of soil, etc. They also give out radioactive emissions. And even in our bones, some radioactive substances can always be present. So we are always exposed to some kind of a natural radioactive emissions, and this is what we call as natural background radiation. That is what we call as natural background radiation, which is always present in our planet, and from which there is no escape. But that is not the emission, or that is not the radioactivity about which we are concerned. We are primarily concerned about the man-made sources of radioactivity. And uh, from where do these radioactive substances come up? Now, if you think of, say, the modern nuclear power plants, where we use primarily uranium as the fuel. So, uranium mining. So, when you are dealing with uranium, definitely uranium is radioactive, and uranium mining definitely leads to spread of these radioactive materials into the environment, thereby causing radioactive pollution in the environment. Then, if you think of the use of radioactive materials in research, that can be research pertaining to the radioactive materials itself, or say research pertaining to agriculture, research pertaining to medical sciences, etc. So from these research labs, there is always a chance of radioactive substances coming out and spreading into the environment. Then if you think of the medical sector, now particularly in cancer research. So in cancer research, we use a lot of radioactive substances for treatment of cancer, for diagnosis of cancer. So once these radioactive materials are used up in these research centers, research labs, clinics, hospitals, whatever, uh, then there is the problem of how to discharge it. So this, it is from these sources that radioactive substances come into the environment. Then if you think of the modern day world, uh, every country, the developed country, the developing countries, there is a sort of a nuclear armament race. So they are trying to make nuclear weapons, and it also results in testing of nuclear weapons. So such preparation and testing of nuclear weaponry also spreads radioactive materials into the environment. And from time to time there can be nuclear accidents, as you know of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, or the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in Japan in 2011. So these nuclear accidents are also a source of radioactive substances being spread into the environment. So after we have talked about these sources, the next thing that will obviously come up is that what are the impacts of radioactivity? Now, a very prominent and obvious impact of radioactive emission is your cancer. Now, several types of cancer can be caused by radioactive emissions or emanations. Say, for example, bone cancer, blood cancer, brain cancer. So, cancer is a very obvious effect of exposure to radioactivity. Then another impact you can think of is the mutations. Where you find that radioactive substances bring about a change in the structure of the chromosome, or in the chromosome number, which we call as chromosomal aberrations. So such mutations and aberrations are very common associated with radioactivity. So you have already heard about the what you can say nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during the August of 1945 in World War II. So whatever people suffered there instantly, that's okay, but generation after generation, children were born with such defects and anomalies associated with these chromosomal mutations and aberrations. So these are some of the most prominent effects of radioactive pollution. What is the control strategy we have for radioactive pollution? Now, the control strategy which we have, first and foremost, the radioactive wastes which we dump into the environment, that has to be dumped very scientifically. You just can't dump your radioactive waste in the open, or you just can't dump your radioactive waste inside the sea. That is absolutely unscientific. So radioactive dumping must be taken off with proper scientific care. Radioactive waste management, particularly if you think of the spent uranium fuel, now what is spent uranium fuel? Now, the uranium which is used up in your nuclear thermal power plants, so once you use up the uranium, so it becomes a waste, but still that waste uranium, that spent uranium, is radioactive because it has a long half-life. You must be knowing about half-lives, where T half is equal to 0.693 by the disintegration constant. So uranium still has a longer half-life. So then the question is, where do we dump these radioactive materials? So radioactive waste management is a very vital aspect associated with radioactive pollution control. And then you have say the waste management has to come up from these research labs, from your hospitals, clinics, etc. And lastly, there has to be some sort of an international cooperation and international goodwill to stop the production and testing of these nuclear weaponry. Otherwise, we cannot control radioactive pollution. Now, you must also remember that you are also exposed to radioactivity in your homes from the various devices and gadgets that you use, your mobile phones, your laptops, your tablets, etc., etc. They all come up with some sort of a radioactive emission. So you are never out of what you can say the range of radioactivity. So with that, we come to the end of a very long chapter, that is pollution. After this, we shall move into disasters. Now, since your examination is quite close, I will quickly run through these topics: disaster, and then some environmental laws and human population. So first, all of you note down what you need to study in this part of disaster. So the first, write down what is a hazard, and then what is a disaster. What is a hazard and what is a disaster? Then write down what are the various types of disaster. What are the various types of disaster? And then write down uh, write a general essay on disaster management. Write a general essay on disaster management. Okay, so just let me give you a brief idea about hazards and disasters. Now see, a hazard is a potentially dangerous situation. But a disaster is an unfortunate event which leads to loss of life, property, and damage to the environment as a whole. So if you're living on the banks of a river, that means you're living on a hazardous location. But if there is a flooding, and due to that flood you lose your life, you lose your property, and that is what you call as a disaster. So hazards lead to disaster, remember that. So hazard is a potentially dangerous situation or location or activity, whatever, but a disaster is an unfortunate event that will lead to loss of life, as well as property, as well as damage to the environment, ecosystem, and whatnot. So what are the different types of disasters? Now, overall, you can classify disasters into two broad types. One is the natural disaster, and other is the man-made disaster. Now, natural disaster, as you can understand, that it will occur in nature over which we have no control. We can't regulate natural disasters, like for example, say earthquakes and tsunamis, etc., etc. And the other is the man-made disaster, which we create. Say, for example, war, rioting, or say some kind of a technological disaster. Now, what is a technological disaster? Now, a technological disaster is something when something very wrong, or when a huge glitch comes up with the machines and techniques that you use, or the technology that you use. For example, think of the internet technology, the World Wide Web. Now, if there is a crash in the internet technology, say even for 2 hours or 3 hours, that will lead to massive loss of property, that will lead to massive loss of information. It will create problem in every possible sector of this planet. So that is what you call as a technological disaster, which in turn is a man-made disaster. So if we are thinking of the natural disasters, now natural disasters can be of different types. They can be, say, geological disasters, say for example earthquakes and associated tsunamis, volcanic explosions. They can be disasters related to water, say for example floods. Flood is a water related disaster. They can be atmospheric disasters, say for example the tropical cyclones, or the hurricanes, or the typhoons, or tornadoes, whatever you might call them. So natural disasters can be of very different types. They can be climatological disasters also, say for example the global climate change which we are experiencing right now. And next, note down what are the disasters which you will study for your examination purpose. Please note down the disasters which you will study for your examination purpose. Write down number one, floods. Number two, droughts. Number 3, earthquakes and tsunamis.
Sir, can you please repeat number 1?
Number 1, floods. Number 2, droughts. Number 3, earthquakes and tsunamis. Number 4, cyclones. Number 5, landslides. So I'm repeating all the disasters. If you have missed out, you can note them down again. Floods, droughts, earthquakes and tsunamis. Then you have cyclones and ultimately landslides. Now you must remember, for all these disasters which I have listed, you will study the cause, the effect and control. I think this you can make up on your own. I have also provided you with some notes in your groups. Okay, now let me just give you a brief idea about disaster management. Now, whenever you hear the term management, now management means to wisely tackle or handle a situation. Now, in your life, you will come across multiple situations or problems. Now, management will envisage how you are tackling those problems. So, if we are talking of disaster management practically refers to the set of scientifically thought out strategies, the set of scientifically thought out activities which you undertake prior to a disaster, during a disaster, and after a disaster to minimize loss and to recover lives and property. That is what we call as disaster management. So disaster management practically has 3 dimensions. One is a pre-disaster activity, which you can also call as disaster preparedness. Now, say for example, if you are living in an earthquake prone area, so you have to what you can say always keep in stock some amount of dry food, some medicines, some stock water, some what you can say storage batteries, some lights which can operate on batteries, and you must repair your houses from time to time so that there is no loose ends of the house which will fall down and break down. So these are some of the disaster preparedness associated with earthquakes. And then there is some strategies which you have to undertake during the course of a disaster. So say for example, if suddenly now, as we are going through the class, if there is an earthquake, it can always happen. Earthquakes come without a warning. So what do we do right now? So the moment there is an onset of an earthquake, the first thing people do, they run out of the house, and that is the most idiotic thing you can do. So the first thing you need to do is to move under some sort of a table, or get yourself covered by some kind of what you can say bedding, so that when falling objects are coming down upon you, you can protect yourselves. You can protect your heads and kidneys from injuries and backbones from injuries. So these are the steps associated with during the course of the disaster. So you have to live through the disaster. And then comes the post disaster strategies. Now remember, post disaster, multiple problems come up. There is a problem of dead bodies. Numerous people die, unfortunately, and that will lead to spread of diseases. Epidemics come up. There is an acute shortage of drinking water, shortage of blood. People get injured, people don't get blood in the hospitals. Shortage of medicines, shortage of food, electricity. All transport and communication lines will be down. Road transport may crash. There may be a bridge crash. So post disaster activity will ultimately target to recover lives, to save lives, and to restore the pre-disaster condition. So suppose if there is an earthquake, if a city is absolutely devastated, so post that devastation, the activities and investments will be targeted towards restoring of that original condition. And that will take a lot of effort, lot of time, and definitely it will take a lot of what you can say investments. Now say for example, if you go to Japan, now people take their insurance against earthquakes. In India, we don't have such insurance coverages. So suddenly if you go to your insurance agent and tell that you want to protect your house against an earthquake, for that you need to buy an insurance, you won't get it. But in Japan, it's a very common phenomenon. So such strategies which you take up prior to disaster, or during a disaster, or post disaster, thought out activities, planned activities, scientifically justified and judicious activities, is what we call as disaster management. So try to elaborate on this topic. Okay, now two more things you need to study for your exams associated with disaster is number one, the Bhopal gas tragedy. The Bhopal gas tragedy. Remember, it's a man-made disaster. It's one of the largest industrial accidents which has taken place in India, and it took place most probably in December 1984, when the methyl isocyanate gas leaked out from the storage facilities of the Union Carbide. So you must know about that disaster. It's a man-made disaster. Several people lost their lives. People lost their eyesight. Children were born with deformities, etc., etc. And then one more disaster you need to study about, that is your uh, the Chernobyl disaster. It's a nuclear disaster which took place in Russia. Presently, it's in Ukraine. Chernobyl is a little village in Ukraine. It's a small county in Ukraine, and that disaster took place in 1986, where the nuclear power plant, the reactor underwent a meltdown. So the melting of the reactor resulted in massive spread of radioactive substances throughout Europe. So that took place in Chernobyl, located in Ukraine, and it took place at around 1986. So these are the two man-made disasters which are very frequently asked in the examination. You might be asked as a
So,
5 marks question.
can you please repeat the name of the second disaster?
Chernobyl, 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 Chernobyl disaster. Acha. Now, these are the two man-made disasters which you will be preparing for your examination. Acha. The next topic for your examination which you have to go through is write down human population. Write down human population. We are running through it a bit fast because your examinations are quite near. It's coming up. Acha. Coming down to human population growth. Now, in this context, first you have to know the definition of population. Okay, so as far as population is concerned, a population refers to a group of individuals belonging to a particular species and occupying a particular space and living in a particular unit of time. So, a very defining property of population is that members of the population belong to the same species. That means who can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. So, if you're thinking of a population, say, if you're thinking of the human population or the population of tigers or dogs or elephants, so whenever we think of population, we think of an aggregation of organisms which belong to the same species. That means which can interbreed and produce fertile offsprings. Fertile offsprings means the offsprings will grow up and they will also be able to participate in the reproductive procedure and continue their race, continue their species towards perpetuity, that is infinite existence. Okay, now if we are talking of human population, the things which you need to study up here is you need to note down, write down number one, causes of human population growth. Causes of human population growth. Why is the human population growing? There are several reasons which you can analyze and find out. Improvement in our technology, improvement in our lifestyles, improvement in our medical facilities, more and more what you can say, comfortable lives are coming up. Less amount of war. If you go back 500 years, the number of wars fought and the wars fought now are much lesser. So all this has led to an increase in the human population. So, and very importantly, human population growth is quite related to the technological advancements which our species has made. So the more technologically advanced we become, there is every chance that we will continue to grow. But obviously that growth also has a limit. You can't grow infinitely, you can't grow exponentially. That is not possible. So the moment you hit the carrying capacity of the planet, the moment you reach the carrying capacity, you are using enough resources of this planet, and then your population is going to dwindle, it's going to come down. So that's a very positive fact. But you have to go through what are the causes of human population growth. Then write down, discuss the impacts of population explosion on the planet's environment. Discuss the impacts of population explosion on the planet's environment. So as you know that as population expands, multiple problems come up with it. Multiple problems you can think of, say problem of job, food, shelter, security, energy, and you can build upon these topics. Say, for example, if you go to the urban areas of India, more often than not, in every city you'll be finding slums. People don't have good access to sanitation. People don't have access to clean water. Health facilities are down. Not everyone can afford a medical insurance. And there are multiple aspects associated with this population explosion's impact on the environment. So you can prepare an essay on it. It can be a 10 marks question, or it can be a 5 marks question also. Right on the next question, suggest some strategies of population control. Suggest some strategies of population control. So population control can have multiple strategies, ranging from what you can say, some hormonal strategies to surgical strategies to some policies. So, for example, if you think of our country in terms of policies, if I'm talking of, say, post independence in 1947, India was the first country to adopt family planning. But in spite of adopting family planning way back in 1950s, today India is the most populous country in the world. So it clearly shows that our family planning adoption, although on paper we have adopted it, but in our real lives we did not adopt it. So uh, that is why we face multiple problems in our country: problem of job, problem of food, energy, and multiple situations are coming up. So population control is a very vital aspect as far as our existence on this planet is concerned. So these are the three things that you need to study about human population. Then let us come down to diseases. Then let us come down to diseases. Now, as far as your diseases is concerned, you have to study about the following important diseases. So diseases, you will classify them as airborne, food and waterborne, soilborne, and STDs. STDs means sexually transmitted diseases. Airborne, water and foodborne, soilborne, and STDs. And STDs. Now, if you're talking of airborne diseases, you can think of them to be bacterial diseases and viral diseases. Bacterial and viral disease. For example, say tuberculosis. That's a bacterial disease. On the other hand, if you think of diseases like the common cold, influenza, or in the present world, COVID-19, these are all viral diseases. So you must know the name of the disease along with its causative organism. Name of the disease along with its causative organism. Same goes with waterborne diseases. Now, waterborne diseases also you can come across, say, viral, bacterial, and protozoan diseases. Say, if say for example, if you are thinking of the hepatitis virus, it causes the disease hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. Hepa means liver, and titis means some kind of inflammation associated with it. So the hepatitis virus is responsible for causing hepatitis, and a common symptom associated with it is the jaundice, yellowing of urine, yellowing of the white of the eye, yellowing of nails, etc., etc. So think about these diseases, and you must know the name of the disease, the causative organism, and one or two symptoms at the most. Now, if you are thinking of some bacterial diseases which are waterborne, say for example cholera, caused by Vibrio cholerae, or say for example typhoid, which is a food and waterborne disease caused by Salmonella typhosa. Or if you're thinking of say a protozoan disease, all of you who are from biological background, you have studied about protozoa. So now these a very common protozoan disease which all of us have suffered at one point or the other, that is amoebiasis caused by amoeba or entamoeba histolytica. So that's a very common waterborne protozoan diseases. Likewise, you have to study about these STDs, the sexually transmitted diseases. Now, sexually transmitted diseases, whenever we think of AIDS. AIDS is the ultimate form of STD. But other than that, there are other STDs also. Say, for example, syphilis, gonorrhea. Then you have different kinds of warts, etc., etc. But it is about AIDS that you have to study in a bit more detail. It is about AIDS that you have to study in a bit more detail, that what are the causes of AIDS and what do not cause AIDS. So there is a huge what you can say misconception in India about AIDS, that if you shake hands with an AIDS patient you will get AIDS. That is utter nonsense. Say if a mosquito bites an AIDS patient and it comes back and bites us, we will also get AIDS. That is also utter nonsense. So you have to know what causes AIDS and what does not cause AIDS. So it's a very common question in the examination. And then you must know the full form of AIDS, for example, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Now, why is it called a syndrome? A syndrome is a collection of symptoms. What is a syndrome? Medically, a syndrome is a collection of symptoms. And then if you think of the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, attacking and weakening the immune system. So ultimately, no one dies of AIDS, you die of other diseases because of a weakened immune response. So these are the things which you have to know about AIDS. Now you must also know about some vector-borne diseases. Now the two commonest vector-borne diseases in our country. Now a vector is a disease carrier, you must be knowing that. For example, a mosquito, a fly, or a rat. These are all vectors. So the two commonest vector-borne diseases in our country are, say, malaria and dengue. Malaria is caused by the Plasmodium vivax, or maybe Plasmodium falciparum, or maybe Plasmodium ovale or Plasmodium malariae. There are four different species of Plasmodium which are often associated with malaria. And then you have the dengue, which is caused by a virus. So you must be hearing of the term DHF, dengue hemorrhagic fever, which is a very disastrous condition associated with dengue and quite difficult to recover once DHF sets in. And then I would also suggest you, although it's not mentioned in your syllabus, but I would also suggest you to go through COVID-19, because we are all suffering from COVID-19. I have suffered from it twice now. Now, so you have to go through COVID-19. What causes COVID? How does it spread? How it spread can be stopped? What are the basic medications available, etc., etc. So just go through that also. Wearing a mask, maintaining social distance, consulting doctors, taking plenty of water, etc., etc. So although COVID-19 is not mentioned in your syllabus, I will just tell you to prepare it, just to be on the safe side. Okay, so with that you can come to the end of human diseases. And next we'll come down to a few environmental movements. Just note down a few environmental movements which you need to study for your exam. A few environmental movements, write down. Number one, the Chipko movement. Number two, Silent Valley movement. Silent Valley movement, in which took place in Kerala. And then you have the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Chipko, Silent Valley, Narmada Bachao Andolan. So prepare these three movements. Generally, they are asked as a 5 marks question, short notes. But say they can cook up a 10 marks question also. They give you two movements and 5 plus 5. So you must know where and when the movement took place, what was the cause of the movement, and what are the important figures associated with the movement. Now, say for example, if I talk of the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the first name you will take is Medha Patekar. Say for example, if I am talking of the Chipko movement, the first name you will tell is the Sundarlal Bahuguna or Bachni Devi, etc., etc. For example, if you think of the Silent Valley movement in Kerala, so you will be thinking of the name KSSP, the Kerala Sahitya Shastriya Parishad. So these are the names you must know. What names or organizations or institutions are associated with this movement. So Chipko, Silent Valley, and Narmada. These are the three movements that you have to prepare. Okay. And lastly, if you come down to the environmental laws associated with, you must prepare, just note down the names of the laws. But one thing I will tell you, try to avoid the questions associated with these laws, because the language of the law is a bit tough. You just change a word here and there and the meaning of the law changes. So although I'm giving you the topics to study, I've given you some notes also, but since you will be getting a choice, just try to avoid the law part, because it's quite difficult to note and difficult to list also and remember. But still, I'll be giving you what are the major laws which you need to study for your examinations. So write down Air Act 1981. Air Act 1981. Remember the year and the name of the law. Actually, it's called as the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act. It's called as the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, but in short, you can write it as the Air Act. Then comes the Water Act 1974. The Water Act 1974. Water Act is also called as the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974. And then you come across the Forest Conservation Act 1980. The Forest Conservation Act 1980. Then write down the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, and then the Environment Protection Act 1986. The Environment Protection Act 1986. So just prepare these acts. Prepare 2 to 3 points pertaining to these acts so that in the exam you can just jot down something. But if there is a choice, if you can...
Sir, please repeat again.
Okay, I'm repeating the acts once again. Number 1, write down the Air Act 1981. The Air Act 1981. Number 2, the Water Act 1974. Then you have the Forest Conservation Act 1980. Then you have the Wildlife Protection Act 1972. And then you have the Environment Protection Act 1986. The Environment Protection Act 1986. Okay. Achha, so with that, just one more thing before I forget. Also prepare a short note on the Rio Summit 1992. Also prepare a short note on the Rio Summit 1992. It is also called as the Earth Summit or the Vasundhara Summit. It took place in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992, and it's mainly connected to sustainable development. Then there are associated MDGs, which we call as Millennium Development Goals, etc., etc. The Rio Declaration. So just go through that Rio Summit or the Earth Summit. 5 to 6 points are enough. 5 to 6 points are enough. Okay. With that, we have more or less discussed the entire syllabus. And if you have doubts, if you have any doubts pertaining to the syllabus, please ask me. If you have any doubts pertaining to the syllabus, please ask me. Okay. Since you don't have much of a doubt, I'll be ending the class. So next week we will not be having any class, and I'll be shortly uploading this class in my YouTube channel. I could not upload it because my phone was having some sort of a problem with the screen recording part. So I've sorted it out now. I'll be uploading the class. So with that, we will be ending our class. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.